All right. Hey guys, it's time to review Unit 7 with the years 1890 to 1945. So there is a lot that happens throughout this time period. You can see in the political history. I have it overall kind of organized for you. Progressive era, Woodrow Wilson, World War I, 1920, 1920s, Great Depression. And then World War II happens. That's not as political, but there's just simply a lot that happens in this time period. 1890, that's kind of the end of the Native American Wars. That's when the tragedy and massacre at Wounded Knee occurs. And then, of course, 1945, kind of the capstone there is the end of World War II. So you can think of it as in 1890, we solve our kind of disputes across our country with any kind of foreign body like Native Americans. And now we're able to focus on what is our role outside of America. Politically speaking, we have some major changes occur. So we'll begin with the political history with the Progressive era. So remember in the last time period, we had the Gilded Age where businesses kind of owned and ran everything. Corruption ruled government and economics. Unions were left behind. Farmers were left behind. So the Progressive era begins with a push by Americans to support politicians that are going to bring about change for the common man, and that's led by Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt wasn't meant to be president. He was actually vice president. When McKinley's assassinated, we have our trust buster, our very active and kind of unstoppable force, Roosevelt, come about and change things. So we call him the trust buster because he was willing to stand up to big business. He actually breaks up one of J.P. Morgan's train companies in the Northwest Securities Supreme Court case. He pushes for conservation, protecting our environment from big business who is just using it for their own gains and not thinking about the future. He protects consumers through the Pure Food and Drug Act. If you remember, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle pointed out in the meatpacking industry and how they were sending out bad products, which was hurting people. And so he pushed for those laws. Another thing that I don't have on here are the three main ideas to his square deal, which was the idea of protecting the consumer, of reigning in trust and conservation. So political reforms throughout this time period, Roosevelt helps lead the charge or begin it. But we have other political reforms which return power to the people instead of keeping it in the hands of politicians. We have initiative. Initiative was where people can create their own law. Referendum is where we can get rid of a law without going through politicians. And then recall is where we can actually remove a person from office if we do not approve of what they're doing. And you also have the 17th Amendment, which I don't have on here. That is where we are allowed to directly elect our U.S. senators instead of allowing politicians to choose them. So following following Teddy Roosevelt, we have Woodrow Wilson. We'll skip William Howard Taft because he doesn't fit the main theme of the Progressive era. But Woodrow Wilson comes along and he continues progressive ideas through his attack on what he called the Triple Wall of Privilege. The Triple Wall included attacking tariffs, which is what the Underwood tariff did, drastically lowering the amount of tariff rates. You also have the banking system, which he thought was corrupt and didn't suit the people. So he creates the Federal Reserve. Then he also wants to further rein in big business through the Clayton Antitrust Act, which actually excused unions and farmers cooperatives from being sued under that law. So through both Roosevelt and Wilson's, we see a lot of power return to the people and away from the Gilded Age power of corporations and corruption. However, after Woodrow Wilson, people were kind of burnt out on this preachy message that they had that we all needed change and progress and more laws and regulations. So in the 1920s, we elect a president known as Warren G. Harding. And his slogan, return to normalcy, was the idea of, when in foreign policy ideas, was the idea of getting out of foreign affairs, especially Europe. But at home, it was going back to allowing government to function outside, or rather kind of a return to laissez-faire where they're outside of business and economics. They are hands off. Unfortunately for America, this leads to a lot of political corruption. Throughout Harding's presidency, he had numerous cabinet members commit crimes and get in trouble. And so we unfortunately see kind of Gilded Age corruption return. After Harding dies of a heart attack, he's replaced by a guy named Calvin Coolidge. Now, Calvin Coolidge was not corrupt. In fact, he cleans up the administration. But he was very much laissez-faire. He was very hands-off. he allows business to operate without much restrictions. And this brings some very good things in the form of 1920s economic success and a boom. However, we lose a lot of the control and reining in of big business, which leads to some consequences in the Great Depression. With that said, this brings up the idea of supply side economics, which are also called trickle down economics, where you cut taxes on big business so that that money can trickle down to the people below them. So while all this is going on, we also have the Red Scare, which is the fear of communism. Americans are afraid that communists are going to take over our government. So Mitchell Palmer targets immigrants and kicks those who are either anarchists or especially communists out of our country. Sacco Vanzetti are two Italian immigrants that are put to death because they are believed to have committed a murder despite very little evidence. So they represent nativism as well and our fear of communism. And we also have the Immigration Quota Acts, which severely restricted immigration based upon where they were from. They actually went back to the 1890 census rather than focusing on the amount of immigrants in the 1920s. They based it upon the amount of South and Eastern Europeans that were there in the 1890s when there were very little. So it severely restricted immigration. In World War I, we have politics enter the fray because of the protests of Eugene Debs and Charles Schenck. Eugene Debs was a union leader who believed that his workers were the ones being sent to fight and die instead of any, I guess, wealthier Americans. And so he protested the draft, which got him put in jail due to the Sedition Act. And Charles Schenck was also a worker, and he appeals being sent to prison for his pamphlets he was printing about the draft. And so we have Schenck versus United States, where our government says that it's okay to restrict our freedoms, especially freedom of speech, if it puts our nation into danger. So that brings us to the Great Depression. So we've had Progressive era with a very active government. We have the 1920s with a very inactive government. And when the Great Depression hits, what ends up happening is a massive collapse in the banking system in nearly every facet of our society. But a lot of it was based upon the mistakes made in allowing businesses to do whatever they wanted. So when Hoover comes around, he does not want to spend money because he wants to continue the Republican idea of laissez-faire government, hands off. He doesn't want to spend a lot of money. So when the bonus army comes to Washington and says, you owe us our bonus check from World War I, and Hoover and Congress tell them no, he is forced to remove them from the Capitol. So the reason why that's an issue is I mean, when we look at today, how we react to crises, I mean, even look at the coronavirus thing we have going on today. Our government, since the Great Depression, after Hoover, whenever there's a crisis, we expect our government to intervene and to bail us out in some way. And so that brings us to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a true trailblazer as far as politics, who promises intervention in his campaign. And once he wins the election, he spends billions of dollars trying to revive the economy. He does this through numerous different ways. First, the FDIC. He closed down banks and then says they can't open up unless they pass certain tests and restrictions, including having insurance on people's investments and savings in the banks, which is what the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, did. They guaranteed that your money would be safe in the banks. Otherwise, the government would pay you that money. So the FDIC helps protect the banking industry and reforms it. Then you have Social Security. Social Security encourages older people to retire so that they can have money to live off of, and that opens up jobs for younger people. That is still around today. The AAA helped farmers. The Agricultural Adjustment Act allowed them to make money for growing less crops to balance out the massive drop in prices and profit. The PWA, the Public Works Administration, created jobs for Americans through what we call public works. The CCC created conservation work for young men who couldn't find jobs because people with more experience were kept around because they probably had not only experience but also families. Tennessee Valley Authority not only created jobs for Americans in the Southeast around the Tennessee Valley, it also created dams, which created electricity and protected agriculture. So it meant a lot of different things that the South needed. You also have the Wagner Act, which protected workers. It created a lot of things that helped them out, including eventually giving us, well, the main thing is the collective bargaining for unions, that business owners have to negotiate contracts with them. Then you have the Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC said there's no more lying about the value of your business and your stocks. You have to be honest about your profits. That way no one can be tricked into investing, and we don't have another massive collapse built upon businesses' dishonesty. So, that's a lot, isn't it? So the politics have a lot in this time period, especially in that Great Depression. When I think about main ideas, think about how our government is reacting to the coronavirus and how that fits progressive era, very, active government. Compare that to the 1920s where government, was hands off and said, no, we'll be fine. And then think about the ramifications of them kind of not reacting with Hoover, and how the Depression deepened over his 4 years as president rather than having any kind of fix. And then FDR, as he took a lot of intervention, he spent a lot of money, and for the first 4 years, it was very successful. But don't forget that they do have a recession in 1937, which proves maybe it just creates a small amount of help for Americans, but maybe not a long-term fix. There's a lot in there to discuss on whether an active or inactive government is best in handling crises. Other challenges toward FDR and his New Deal included Charles Coughlin, who was a radio guy who started off being a supporter, but he ends up calling it the Jew deal and falling out of favor with Americans, and he kind of goes away. Huey Long was a senator in Louisiana who was pushing to make every man a king by spreading the wealth across America, basically taking money from the rich and dividing it, which sounds a lot like communism, which might be why he was assassinated. And the court packing plan, where FDR gets frustrated because of his two plans, the AAA, the AAA, and the NRA getting deemed unconstitutional. And because he tries to put more people on the court because he says they're old and don't understand the new modern era, because he tries to do that, America loses faith in him. And after 1937, he doesn't really get many of his plans passed. So again, a lot in that political history there. The main idea being there is clearly a debate over these 50 years over whether or not our government should be active or inactive. We try to fix the Gilded Age through the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era wears people out. So we go back to laissez-faire in the 1920s. The Great Depression comes and the people cry out and say, we don't want an inactive government. We want an active government. So FDR responds. But again, does that fix it? As we've talked about before, it's World War II, which actually ends the Great Depression. So a lot to discuss and debate there in political theme. What is about foreign policy? Well, again, there's a lot going on. Let's begin with the age of imperialism. We had been seeking overseas markets because of our booming economy in the Gilded Age. That led us to annex places like Hawaii. It leads us to fight a war against Spain, the weak empire of Spain. Remember, the first place we attack is not Puerto Rico, which we had claimed was because they were being treated terribly by the Spanish. Rather, the first place we attack is the Philippines all across the world, which tells you that this was really more about us gaining territory than it was about being defenders of the oppressed. After that war ends, we gain Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Reasons why we imperialize, obviously I just said, was to gain more territory. But Americans, the excuses they gave was we were spreading culture and we were civilizing these people. We were giving them Christianity. So in other words, we view our culture and our religion better, and we must deliver these people from their situation to be more like us. Not everybody agreed with it, however, as the Anti-Imperialist League argues it is imperialism goes against natural rights. If you look at our Constitution and the things we promise our people, how could we go back on those ideals as we practice imperialism? So now for specific presidents, we see a developing role of America in the world after imperialism. Roosevelt continues the idea of kind of a powerful America with his big stick diplomacy. His motto was speak softly and carry a big stick. In other words, use our power, especially our powerful Navy, to intimidate nations to get what we want. Now, he tried to use it in a moral sense. And his idea, was the Panama Canal, where he wanted to build a canal which would help out the entire world, but Colombia was being difficult. So he helps Panama gain their independence by intimidating them with our powerful Navy. So he says he's using big stick diplomacy in a positive way. Others would argue that this just shows America was using our fleet to intimidate other nations. William Howard Taft shifts away from using our military and instead uses our money to entice nations to open up. He believed by involving ourselves in smaller countries, we would gain more money for ourselves. And so he would use our industry and our banking system to kind of get in the door to smaller countries. And then whenever things happen in those countries that were going against our economics, we would intervene with the military. So even though he claimed to go away from the military like Roosevelt, he still ended up intervening quite a bit. Which brings us to Woodrow Wilson. He claimed he was going to practice a more moral diplomacy. And so he actually pays he pays Colombia for losing Panama and having the canal built there. He apologizes to China and cancels a railroad contract, which he thought was Western nations controlling them. Beyond that, however, he was not good at backing up the moral side. He intervenes in Mexico without their approval. He intervenes in other small countries, and he actually is the president that leads us into World War I. So why do we fight in World War I? At first, he tries to stay neutral, but we are slowly dragged in because of events. The main events being Germans using U-boats to sink ships, American citizens dying in the sinking of Lusitania. Wilson threatens Germany with war because of that ship sinking. So Germany backs off of U-boats for a while. But in 1917, when they decide it's time to make more moves and shift their troops west, they need to keep America out of it. So they resume U-boat attacks and send a telegram to Mexico asking them to attack us, and then they'll help them get their territory back. With that happening, Wilson sees an excuse that he can get involved. And so he declares war on Germany. And that leads him to announcing his 14 points. So what Woodrow Wilson believed is that America would be kind of the democratic guide for the world, that we would bring the light of democracy to the rest of the world. And so we needed to get involved to save them. So his 14 points were 14 ideas that he believed that if the world followed, we would be saved from international conflict and massive warfare. One of those 14 points, the main one that he wanted, was the League of Nations. This would create a coalition of nations that, if they work together, would keep aggressive countries from basically causing war, because all the other nations in the League would keep them back. With that said, the Treaty of Versailles punishes Germany at the end of the war. It does not adopt almost any of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. It does adopt the League of Nations. However, as you can see here, U.S. actually rejects that League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. And the reason we reject those things is because American congressmen and America as a whole did not want to enter into another warfare. If you remember, we looked at Warren G. Harding's Return to Normalcy up top. That should tell you America was tired of getting involved. And so in the 1920s and into the 1930s, America practices isolationism, removing ourselves from the rest of the world. And this is quite a break from the last 40 years, because we have been heavily involved in the world as imperialism increased. So how do we ensure that we can stay isolated? To stay isolated, America passes or drafts into several agreements, including the Washington Conference. The Washington Conferences leads to the disarmament of the American Navy and the Five Powers Treaty, and it limits the size of the Navy that we and other nations can have. Of course, we were the only nation who followed that agreement, but it still showed our dedication to isolationism and limiting military conflict. The Kellogg-Briand Pact actually deemed war illegal, which worked out really well. Okay, it didn't. So that just shows America's dedication to isolationism. When World War II begins breaking out across the world, you have Japan invading Manchuria and China in the early 1930s. You have Italy invading Ethiopia in the mid-1930s. And then you have Germany beginning to break its agreements in the Treaty of Versailles. So how does America react? We pass a series of neutrality acts to ensure that we will stay neutral. So we move from isolationism to neutrality. We continue to trade with many countries unless they're at war, and then we will break off our trade with them. So the neutrality acts try to keep America out of it. When Japan invades Manchuria, the Simpson Doctrine continues our idea of neutrality, because it says that we do not approve and will not condone, or excuse me, I guess what's the word? We will not recognize Japanese territorial gains in China. But we don't do anything about it. We just say that's bad. So Japan continues to be aggressive. The U.S. Panay is actually attacked by Japan, but America does not call them out like we did against Germany in 1917. So it's interesting to see America take this line of neutrality, even when our ships are being aggressively attacked. So what leads us to intervene? By 1939 and 1940, we realized that evil forces are taking over Europe. And so we begin something called the Lend-Lease Act. As Britain is being attacked by Germany in the Battle of Britain, we agree to lend and lease them tools of war, tanks, bombs, guns, and anything that they use. They will either pay us back or give it back after the conflict. This clearly shows that America has chosen a side in the war, and that means that we are now intervening. Of course, Pearl Harbor drags us into the conflict because, well, they sink ships at Pearl Harbor. Japan does. We declare war on them, and then Germany and Italy declare war on us. So as the war is breaking out, we have the Atlantic Charter where FDR and Churchill agree to a peaceful world. They're going to create the United Nations. They're going to create free elections for everybody. The Yalta Potsdam Conference, the United Nations, helped set up the Cold War afterward and how we're going to handle the stuff after the war. I don't foresee that being something on the AP test, so we're going to skip that for now. To me, that's much more of a discussion for Unit 8 as we go into it. So, there is a lot here, as I've said before. Unit 7 is quite a dense unit, but we're going to keep trudging along. The economics of this era. Progressive era to World War I, 1920s, Great Depression, World War II. There are a lot of ups and downs in this time period. We have some periods of extreme economic success. The Progressive era saw mostly economic success. Following World War I, we actually have a short recession. In the 1920s, we see a massive boom, followed by the collapse in the Great Depression. And then World War II, of course, brings our economy back soaring high. So lots of ups and downs. The Progressive era, one of the major economic debates we had is, should we have high or low tariffs? In the Progressive era, favoring the common man, we see a lot of lower tariffs. When the 1920s arise and we have Republicans and businessmen take back over the ideas, we see supply side and check on economics. We also see tariffs increase in the 1920s. What impacted Americans as well in the 1920s was laissez-faire, allowed businesses to do however they please. You have the assembly line with Ford creating a lot of change and growth, adopted across many different industries. The assembly line created all kinds of products through mass production. In order to sell those products, we created mass advertising, which radios allowed. And then having all these products in our hands, you have the mass advertising. Because of the economic boom, we have money. That leads to mass consumption. So mass production, mass advertising, and mass consumption. How do we buy a lot of these things? Despite the economic boom, it is credit that actually boosts up our economy. The majority of items in this time period were bought through credit, people buying things that they could not afford. And you got to think a lot of that had to do with that mass advertising, saying you needed these things. So as the economic boom comes to an end, there is a lack, or the reason it comes to an end is there's a lack of stock and business regulation. We do not have laws saying you have to be honest about your profits. We do not have laws that stop them from tricking investors. They also overproduce. They didn't know, with mass production being new, they didn't know how much they could continue to sell. So they just created more and more products. And that was a lot of waste of resources, time, and money. And then overconsumption leads to the crash because people were buying more than they could afford. Once businesses started shutting down, they couldn't pay their debts off. And so a lot of people had no way to continue paying their bills. So this leads to the Great Depression. You see the collapse of our economy, a 25% unemployment rate. So a quarter of all working Americans could not find a job. Farmers also struggled. They migrated west to escape the Dust Bowl. They did not find many jobs there, as many of those work programs were full, and so a lot of your farmers struggled very badly in this time period. The New Deal also provides public works, which tried to give a boost to the economy by providing temporary jobs. Both world wars economically provide opportunities in northern urban areas, especially those who are African Americans leaving the South to find those jobs. Women also fill in the workplace during both these world wars. So the wars see a major benefit economically for both African Americans and women in the workplace. And then the war economy of World War II creates a recovery from the Great Depression. It was the booming war economy, creating tanks and guns and weapons and ships and planes and uniforms. That's what really helped us recover from the Great Depression, because nearly every American could find a job. If you weren't fighting for our country, you were at home working in the factories. Lend-Lease also makes us a manufacturer for the Allies. Not only are we making weapons and the goods for our own soldiers and military, we're also making things for other countries. So America had non-stop jobs available. So that is the economics, a very up and down period. However, we see a lot of very positive things there for many groups. And this brings us to religion. Religion battles in the 1920s, especially with science, with social, scientific, and technological changes. Flappers were women who challenged their social role. You can understand why religion would battle with that. Women were supposed to be the people who held home safe and taught values to our children, and were, I guess, supposed to be chaste. And we had a very specific image for what a woman was supposed to be. But 1920s women, with their new right to vote, with the 19th Amendment, with their working in the workplace during World War I, they had a lot of independence. And in the 1920s, they really challenged their role in society through that, dressing differently, drinking, smoking, cursing, talking in ways that they had never done so before. Other ways we challenge religion is evolution versus faith. We have the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee. Fundamentalists say that you cannot teach evolution in our schools because the Bible says that God created the world and humans as they are, so evolution can't be true. And so fundamentalists battle with those who are supporting evolution. Automobiles also allow a lot of freedom to go and sin. They called them sin wagons, the older generation did, because of the, I guess you could say, promiscuity of the youth through these new automobiles. So you have a lot of challenges to traditional religion and values because of these technological, scientific, and social changes. You also have the Prohibition period. Prohibition. The 18th Amendment prohibited the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol. Unfortunately for Americans, that just led to crime to increase. Most people ignored the law. Worse, organized crime arose with men like Al Capone in Chicago making millions off of it with no tax money going toward the government. And then they also created a lot of violence and kind of chaos across our country. And then first and foremost, Prohibition costs a lot of money, not only to enforce these laws with more policemen, more jails, etc., but also no tax revenue. And so the 21st Amendment is passed in 1933 as the Great Depression begins, or the reaction begins under FDR. He knew that we could pay for a lot of his programs through allowing the sale of alcohol. So religion does play a pretty significant role here in Unit 7. What about women? As I mentioned earlier, women worked in factories during World War I and World War II. They were vital to keeping the war efforts going. So that gave them a lot of economic freedom. You also have muckrakers who wrote articles which brought awareness to evil businessmen like Ida Tarbell, pointing out John D. Rockefeller. We mentioned Ida B. Wells in a previous unit, pointing out or leading the charge against lynching across our country. She was an African-American woman, wanted to protect her people from this savage practice. And so she also was a muckraker and important woman in this time period. 19th Amendment grants women the right to vote in 1920. That leads us to flappers as well. Other challenges for women's freedom include Margaret Sanger. She created the American Birth Control League, which said that women had the right to choose whether or not they had children. And they also had the right to control their own sexual practices. And so Margaret Sanger pushes for the acceptance of birth control. Her group will, of course, eventually become Planned Parenthood. African Americans at this time period see large changes through a continued great migration to the north. In World War II, they moved from the South to escape discrimination, and they moved to what they thought might be the promised land of the North. They thought it would be safer and better for them, not only for new economic opportunities, but an escape from the tradition of discrimination and oppression in the South. Unfortunately, as we know, it was not perfect in the North. We talked about the Chicago race riot in class. So unfortunately for African Americans, they face a lot of challenges. Men who lead the fight for them and their rights in this time period include W.E.B. Du Bois. He said, "We want our rights now," as opposed to Booker T. Washington from our last unit, who said, "Get educated, climb the economic and social ladder first." Du Bois says, "No, we deserve our rights immediately." And so he creates the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which sues and fights for African American rights across our country. And that will actually be the organization which will lead the charge in the Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s, which gets rid of segregation in schools. Marcus Garvey was kind of a little different. He thought African Americans deserved their right to equality, but he also pushed the idea of back to Africa. He said it's hard to get any kind of equality in America, so he wanted to almost separate blacks from whites, create their own culture. Unfortunately for Marcus Garvey, he is eventually sent away from America for mail fraud because he was originally Jamaican. One major cultural movement for African Americans is the Harlem Renaissance, began in Harlem, New York. And it's a cultural movement which fought against the discrimination they faced. It had famous musicians, especially jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. And then you have great writers like Langston Hughes. You have a lot of great culture coming out of the Harlem Renaissance. And the main idea was we, despite this discrimination, should have confidence in ourselves. A. Philip Randolph is another leader. He brings an end to war industry discrimination by threatening a march on Washington. Even as the war effort is building, he says we deserve equal treatment. And his threat to march on Washington leads to the creation of laws that stop the government from being able to discriminate and only give jobs to whites. Brings us to Native Americans. Ooh, this is a lot, isn't it? Yes, it is. Native Americans, what do they do in this time period? Well, if you want to go back to 1890, that's actually the tragedy and massacre of Wounded Knee. All Native Americans get put onto reservations. And for the next 30, 40 years, they have no rights whatsoever. So FDR, in his New Deal, he also sought to help out Native Americans through the Indian Reorganization Act, also called the Indian New Deal. What they did is they gave sovereignty back to Indian reservations, allowing them, I cut that off there, basically allowed them to make decisions and laws for their own people. They were allowed to organize as a tribe again. They were allowed to be outside of the control of states. They are now only subject to the federal government. So what that allows them to do is allows them a lot more freedom in deciding what happens on their reservations. That's what basically sovereignty is. It is not perfect. They still struggle because they mostly have to stay where they're located, but at least they have some power given back to them. In World War II, they also serve as code talkers, allowing us to communicate without the fear of decoding. And they play a massive part in defeating, especially the Japanese, because they cannot break our codes. All right, immigration. So we mentioned the Red Scare leading to the Palmer raids, where we kicked out immigrants that we thought were communists. The fear of immigrants also leads to a rise in the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan reached, depending on which textbook you're reading, anywhere from 1 million to 4 or 5 million members in the early 1920s. And it wasn't limiting African-American rights that was their main push. It was limiting immigration. So the Immigration Code Act of 1924 severely limited new immigration by cutting it down to 2% of the amount of immigrants that were here in 1890. And so that really restricts the amount of immigrants that can come to America. In World War II, talking about different immigrants here, we're normally talking about European immigrants, but the Bracero program allows Mexicans to work in southwestern agriculture to fill demands of the war. They're able to come across the border and work in the Southwest and help feed our country. Many of them end up becoming citizens because of this program. So I guess a positive change there with immigration, but we tend to think of this unit as more of the focus of the first Red Scare. As far as technology, some massive technological changes in the 1920s, primarily led by Henry Ford's assembly line, which led to mass production and the creation of consumer society. Other major items are the automobile, radio, which connected our nation to news and entertainment. It's the first wave of celebrities because of radio and because of the mass production of that. And then finally, there's lots of technological advancements in World War II, but the one we remember the most is the atom bomb, because the impact it has not only then, but on our day today. So Manhattan Project was a secret project that was spread around our country. Oak Ridge in Tennessee has its own facility, which helped develop these bombs. And then we end up using those bombs on Japan, which brings a swift end to the War of August in 1945. Whew. So a lot of different ideas and themes here in Unit 7. Hopefully this helps you kind of organize your thoughts so you can just skip back and forth on the parts that you need to hear explanations about. And once again, you can also just simply ask me later on. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions, feel free to message me, and I will talk to you again soon. Have a good one.